and you need some notes. So everybody should have this set of notes that begins on page 14, and we will be picking up on page 15. But does everybody have a set of notes? Anybody not have? All right, very good. Thank you guys for distributing those. This is our series, Relationships, A Mess Worth Making. This is session number 6. So there have been 13 previous pages, and those are available on our website, as are the lessons themselves, the audio for the lessons. So I encourage you, if you've not been able to be at the previous sessions or missed some of them, that you can pick up those there. We left off on page 15, looking at Ephesians chapter 4 and what God says about how He works to create unity within diversity in relationships. Ephesians chapter 4 is written to a church in the city of Ephesus, so it's a church setting, but I've made the point that the principles that are given here apply to all of your relationships. So don't think that these are merely confined to a church setting, but rather you can apply them to any of your relationships. Now, before we get into the bottom portion of page 15 where we left off, I want to remind you of some things that we've talked about in this series since we're already 5 weeks into it, and that I've given you in the past, but they're applicable to what we have on these remaining pages. That what it is that causes us at its heart to place ourselves, in fact, if you'll look at the bottom of page 15, that fourth paragraph from the bottom, the one that starts, hard work can be satisfying. Paul knows that relationships, even among people who have the Spirit, are not easy. The biblical work ethic for relationships is that it requires work, and the work is worth it when we see God's glory and praise in mind. Many give up when the relationship requires work, or when we, and then I want you to notice this phrase, we place ourselves at the center instead of God's calling. When we place ourselves as the purpose, we often decide the dividend yield is not worth the investment. Now, I read that last week, but didn't go into it in any detail. What happens when we place ourselves at the center of God's calling for our relationships? What happens? How does it go south? And why does it occur in the first place? So I want to remind you of the scriptural teaching about what rules our hearts if it's not the design of God. If God does not rule our heart in our relationships, if we're not pursuing God's calling in our relationships, then what is it that's ruling our hearts? And one way to look at that, and that I've found very helpful over the years, is to see anyone or anything ruling our hearts other than God as idolatry. It's idolatrous. Now, the Bible uses language of idolatry a lot. In the first part of your Bible, the Old Testament, it speaks a lot about idolatry as the way I think most of us think of it, which is I have a statue of wood or I have something made of stone and I bow down before it. And if I do that, then I'm an idolater. Well, that's a form of idolatry. It is certainly dethroning God in favor of something else. But it's not the only, and it's not even the most ubiquitous. It's not even the most common way that idolatry is manifest. I don't know what ubiquitous means. I just like to say it every now and then. But it's not even the most common. The most common form of idolatry is not physical idolatry, bowing down to a statue. It's heart idolatry. The prophet Ezekiel said of the people of Israel at that time that they have set up idols in their hearts. These people have set up idols in their hearts. John Calvin said that the human heart is an idol factory, that our hearts can manufacture idols out of anyone or anything. So when we place ourselves at the center instead of God's calling, another word for that is you've displaced God and you've replaced God with someone or something else. That's called idolatry. So it raises the stakes when you use biblical language to talk about it like that. It's not just that I'm not living for God the way I should. I ought to get my act together a little bit more. No, we're practicing idolatry when we do this. When we place someone or something above the value of God. Now, how does it work? I've told you in the past how it works, but it's relevant now at this juncture of our series. The progression of an idol goes like this. The progression of an idol begins with something or someone I want. It starts with I want. Now, this is not in your notes. If I loved you, I would have put it in the notes. Since I don't love you enough, you have to write it down. The progression of an idol starts with I want. And that word want could be I desire. You could say it starts with I desire. So I want someone or something. That someone or something may be a good or neutral thing in itself. The thing or the person may not be evil. It just starts with what I want. But then I become so convinced that this thing I want, I need to obtain, I must need to obtain, then it moves from I want to I need. This is not just a general desire, this is something that I need to have, or someone that I need to have. You've convinced yourself that it's a genuine need in order for you to function properly. Now, the psychological world is filled with need terminology. Much of counseling is based upon a filling of needs. And so the counseling tries to discover where your needs have not been met and then seeks to tell you how to fill those needs. And so this idea of I want and then I need is very popular. It's something that most of us have experienced, that most of us have pursued to one degree or another. Then it moves from I want, I need to I must. I must have this person or thing. Now you say, what's all that got to do with relationships? You've given us three things. I want, I need, I must, and I is singular. So what does that have to do with relationships? Well, two things. Do you all remember that from a biblical standpoint, in every relationship there are always at least three persons? That there's the two humans involved, but then there's God, and God's always the most important. So even in those three things that I gave, I want, I need, I must, even in those three, and even though it's all about me and I'm internally deliberating about this, and I'm not engaged with another person, another human being, even in all of that, I'm interacting with God. When I think about what I want, what I need, what I must have, I'm doing that in the presence of God. And I'm thinking about my needs and my wants and my must-haves in terms of what God has supplied or failed to supply. So it always involves God. And even though the I is singular, you have been interacting with God as we do every moment of every day. All of our thoughts are transacting in one way or another with regard to what we think about God. Now, what about our human relationships? What happens next is number 4. There are 6 of these. The first is I want, the second is I need, the third is I must, but then the pronoun changes from I to you. I mean, if I have a legitimate need and I must have it, and I'm in relationship with you, then here's the 4th thing. You should. You should supply it. You should do everything that you can within your power to make sure that I have this person or thing that I must have, that I need. And the you that should can be God or it can be another human being. So, you ever hear people say, I'm angry with God? Why are they angry with God? Well, they're angry with God because I have some need, I have something that I must have, and God hasn't supplied it. Therefore, I'm angry with God. You, God, should. You, God, should have supplied this thing for me, whatever it is. And then for another human being, if I'm in a relationship, if I'm married, I've got a list of things that you, my spouse, should supply. So you should. But then here's the fifth thing. You didn't. You've disappointed me. You failed me. You didn't supply this need that I must have. And so as a result of that now, the relationship is affected by the sixth and final step, which is you should, you didn't, you'll pay. You'll pay. So I did a marriage seminar all day yesterday at another church. And I said to them, that a relationship, it was a marriage seminar, so many marriages are in you'll pay mode. Many relationships are two people who can't stand each other. Many marriages are a husband and a wife who are tolerating each other. They're tolerating each other perhaps for economic reasons. Perhaps they stay together for the kids' sake. But it's not because they want to be there together. It's not because they love each other. It's not because they're pursuing this relationship with God's agenda in mind. They stay together and they have an existence, but they don't have a marriage. It's possible to be legally married, live in the same house, and simply have an existence and not a marriage. What a sad thing. But that's because many people are in you'll pay mode. And they have been for many, many years. Now, how did it get to that point? It got to this point where each is disappointed with the other, each is angry with the other because you should, you didn't, you'll pay. They didn't have a biblical framework for how to deal with analyzing what it is they're holding others accountable to supply to them, and then to reconcile in a biblical way. They have no plan for that. Next week, we're going to give you a sheet, or several sheets, that's a 13-point plan for how to handle your sin, somebody else's sin, and how to reconcile those. So for next week when you come, you get new paperwork, and it'll be a 13-point plan. But these couples that are in this you'll pay mode have never gone through a plan, a biblical plan, for how to handle these differences that inevitably come up. How to analyze whether or not these should be demands I should be making at all, and even if they are demands that I should be making, how do I handle being disappointed with them not being supplied? And so most people have never done that, don't know how to handle that. They're in the relationship, it goes on for years, and their disappointment and their seething anger very often just is bottled up for some, erupts for others. So that's the progression of an idol. I want, I need, I must, you should, you didn't, you're going to pay. Now, what are these idols that rule our hearts that affect our relationships? I said they may be neutral, they may even be good, not sinful in themselves. Very often that's the case. Some of you have heard me say this over the years. Idols are often found in wanting good things too much. Idols are often found in wanting good things, but you want them too much. So what kind of good things might I want too much? Well, I might want a husband who respects me. I might want a husband who talks to me, who communicates. Is that a good thing? That would be a good thing. That's a good desire. How do you know if you want it too much? You know you want an otherwise good thing too much when you are willing to sin in its absence. When you sin in reaction to not having it. When you sin in reaction to not having it, it has now become idolatrous to you. I must have this. I must have a husband who does this. And if I don't have a husband who does this, I can't live for Jesus. I can't be joyful, even though the Bible says, rejoice in the Lord always, and I will say it again, rejoice. And even though the guy who wrote that, rejoice in the Lord always, be joyful always, I'll say it again, the guy who wrote that, the Apostle Paul, at the time he wrote that, was not in ideal circumstances. He was in prison. He was chained to a Roman guard. So you might say, well, it's easy for him to say, be joyful. He's the Apostle Paul. Regularly imprisoned, beaten, ultimately executed, Paul says, rejoice. And he was actually a very joyful guy, as you read his letters. Because the joy was not based on external circumstances, not based on what people did to him, not based on whether people supplied things when and how he wanted. It was based upon Christ. And so idols are often found in wanting good things too much. I might want a husband that treats me with respect and communicates with me. I might want kids that are obedient. That's a good thing to want. How do you know that it's become an idol? When, in reaction to your child not obeying you, you, in sinful anger, haul off and smack them across the face. Now that is demonstrating that this idol has taken control of your heart. You want it too much. It is an idol because you're willing to sin in its absence. Now, what these idols all have in common is this. You have made yourself the standard. You have made what you want the standard, rather than what God is doing in and for you as the standard. And that's what you see at the bottom of page 15 then. We place ourselves at the center instead of God's calling. When we do that, we often decide the dividend yield in these relationships is not worth the investment. But here's what God says: be humble, gentle, patient, forbearing with one another in love. Even before Paul, beginning in verse 25, gives specific actions that we're to take. In Ephesians chapter 4, he describes these 4 key character qualities that are sometimes the opposite of what drives our relationships. So here's what I want us to do. I want us to look at these 4 things: humble, gentle, patient, forbearing, and I want us to think about what the opposite of those is. Bottom of page 15, humility should characterize our relationships. This quality enables us to see our own sin before we focus on the sin and weakness of another. Do you hold others to a higher standard than you do yourself? All right. So I ask you, what is the opposite of humility? So arrogance, pride, okay? So the Bible calls for humility in our relationships, but what we bring to our relationships is a pride that has us as the standard. Why can't everybody be like me? Top of page 16, gentleness. A gentle person is not weak, but someone who uses strength to empower. A gentle person can use strength without damaging those he's trying to help. Do people regularly feel bruised in their relationship with you? So what's the opposite of being gentle? Again, you could use a number of synonyms, but harsh. Are you harsh in your interactions with others? If you are harsh with others in your interactions, what's motivating that? What's motivating that is something in your heart that you want from them that they're not doing. An idol. So the opposite is harsh. Patience. This quality places others' needs higher than or at the same level as our own. We don't come with a self-centered agenda. So what's the opposite, though, of being patient with someone? It's being demanding with someone. I'm not going to be patient. I want you to do this or be this now because I'm the standard. I'm the center. And then there is forbearance. A forbearing person is one who's humble, gentle, and patient, even when provoked. Do you love people with limits that are driven by your own perceived needs or interests? Do others feel as if they must always return a favor to keep you happy with them? Even when provoked. So what's the opposite of forbearing? It's retaliation, for lack of a better term. I'm not going to forbear even when they provoke me. I'm going to retaliate when they provoke me. Because we have received grace, we are to give grace to others in our relationships. Often, a structure of law, offense, and punishment governs relationships. So, for example, I have a set of rules that you have to abide by. I watch to make sure you follow them, and I'm justified to mete out some form of punishment if you do not. This is a flagrant contradiction of the gospel. God's grace and favor in our lives should reflect His glory and show up in our relationships. There's one Spirit, one Lord, and one Father. The basis of our unity is the unity of the triune God, not our ability to get along. We get along because Father, Spirit, and Son have empowered us to do so. So this lesson, back on page 14, up at the top, is called God's Workshop. Our relationships are God's workshop. You see here now, middle of page 16, God's Workshop, appreciating diversity. So the first subpoint in this lesson was God's Workshop, appreciating unity, pursuing unity. Now, God, in His workshop of relationships, produces an appreciation of diversity. So relationships are an environment, a workshop, in which God produces His will. And the tools that God uses in that workshop are the pursuit of unity and appreciation of diversity. That's what we're saying here. Okay? And notice, it's God's workshop. This is God's idea. This is the way God rolls. He puts you in relationships with people to do this stuff, for you to appreciate unity, pursue it, and to appreciate diversity as well. So Ephesians 4 says, to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. Christ gave some, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip His people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now that started with each one has been given grace as Christ has apportioned it. And then you see the different giftings that God has given to His church to produce this unity. Then, verse 14, we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching and the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ. From Him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So you've got the unity and diversity in those verses, do you not? You've got each one at the top has been apportioned grace and gifting by God. And then you have the whole body, verse 16, is joined and held together by each supporting ligament. So it's a unified body, but that body has all of these parts, and we each are those parts. And God has gifted us differently. So God's workshop includes the unity and the appreciation of the diversity. That's true not only in the church, that's true in your other relationships as well. Bottom of page 16. Because it's grounded in the Trinity, our unity also allows us to celebrate our diversity. Now, what would the Trinity have to do with that? You have one God, but you have three persons. You have Father, Son, and Spirit. So you have unity and diversity. One God, three persons. God creates and uses our diversity to accomplish His purpose, namely our growth in grace. Diversity is not an obstacle, but a quite significant means to that end. All right, so I want to stop and talk about that for a little bit. So our relationships clearly involve diversity, right? Because as I look at this room, bunch of people that are different. I know many of you, I don't know all of you. I just know that you all look different. I know that every one of you's got a unique fingerprint. And the Bible tells me that we all have different gifts and abilities and all of that. So that's true of everyone in this room. Everyone sitting here and me standing here. That's true for all of us. So we are a diverse group, and diverse in a lot of ways. I want to talk about how we are diverse in a couple of important ways that affect our relationships and especially our marriages. We are diverse naturally and we are diverse in terms of our nurturing. We're diverse in terms of our nature and in terms of our nurture, both of those. So to say it again, we're different in a lot of ways. There's male and female here. There's short and tall. There's all kinds of physical characteristics you could describe about how we're diverse, how we're different. But I want to deal with these two just broad categories of being different in terms of our nature and our nurture, diverse. And if you don't appreciate both of those, then it's going to cause problems. If you don't appreciate how we are diverse naturally. Every person here was born wired differently. And if you are a self-centered person, then you're going to have a harder time with people who are wired other than you are. Remember, I'm the standard. Everybody should have my wiring. You get married, and you bring that wiring into the relationship. And you married somebody who's not wired the same way. So unless there is an understanding of how this natural diversity is a good tool used in God's workshop, unless we have an understanding of that, we're going to come into a relationship with somebody and we're going to try to make them like us. We're going to be in a competition with them. And many relationships are that. They're in competition. Who's going to have the upper hand? How can I mold you to my will? So there's natural diversity, and the sooner you learn that, appreciate that, and then get to know how this person with whom you are in relationship is naturally different from you, the better off everyone will be. You say, does God really say I'm supposed to study, my spouse to find out how they're different from me? As a matter of fact, it almost uses that very language. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, all right, I'll tell you what it says. But first I'm going to tell you what it says of the wives. Because the men love to go to the wives verse. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And so the husbands go, yeah, get them, pastor. So, on Mother's Day, if I do some message toward the women like that, the men are like, yeah, give it to them. My wife would finally understand she's supposed to submit to me. Everything would be okay. But here's what 1 Peter 3:1 says. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your husbands. In the same way. In the same way as what? Well, if you go back up in chapter 2, you find this word submit up there. And it says, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters. But before it says, Peter says something about slaves, he says something about citizens. In verse 13 of 1 Peter chapter 2, he says, submit yourselves to the governing authorities. So citizens submit themselves to the government. Slaves submit themselves to their masters. That would be an employment context for us. Employees, submit yourselves to your employer, your manager. And then after giving these examples of submitting, placing yourself under, then you come to chapter 3 of 1 Peter, and it says, in the same way, wives. In the same way that citizens submit themselves to the government, in the same way that employees submit themselves to their employer, in the same way, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And I'm looking around this diverse room of males and females, and the females are all looking at me with daggers at this point. Saying, surely you're going to clean that up somehow, aren't you? You can't just leave it there. So here's now back to the husbands. 1 Peter 3:1, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves. And then when you get to verse 7, here's what Peter says. Husbands, in the same way. But ladies, he doesn't say submit, sorry. He doesn't use the word submit, but he uses that same phrase in the same way. In the same way as what? In the same way as wives place themselves under the leadership of their husbands, in the same way that employees place themselves under the leadership of their employer, their manager, in the same way that a citizen places his or herself under the authority of the government, in the same way, you get all the way down to the husbands, in the same way. But it doesn't use the word submit. It says, live with your wives in a considerate way. What does that mean? So when it says considerate, the King James says, dwell with your wives according to knowledge. That's what it says. So when it says considerate, sometimes we'll say so-and-so is a considerate person, and we just mean they're polite or something like that. But here, considerate, and the King James uses dwell according to knowledge for this reason. It's using considerate this way. Consider this. Consider them. Husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in a considerate way. That is, think about them. Think about, consider who they are. Consider who your wife is. And then it goes on in that verse to tell you a little bit who they are. It says they are co-heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so they're equal to you spiritually. But it also says they are also the weaker vessel. Weaker how? Physically weaker, because the women have the babies, and therefore there's a cycle that goes on with that. There's all of the hormonal and the emotional kinds of stuff that goes on with that. I think you could talk about that weaker piece in a number of ways. But understand that about your wife. Husbands, study your wives. Know how they're different from you by nature, that there's this natural diversity just between male and female. And now you, husband, you think about that and you treat her accordingly. She is in a vulnerable position. You treat her accordingly. So treat her as the weaker vessel, as the one who is equal with you. But you do all of this in the same way that this submission of wife to husband, employee to employer, citizen to government goes. How does a husband do that? In the same way. Here's my understanding of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. Husbands, be considerate in the same way, be considerate in the way you live with your wives. Here's what I think God's saying there. I think he's supplying, we're to supply the word submit. It's not there. Because the word submit means to place yourself under. That's just literally what the word means. In the case of the government, you place under government authority. In the case of an employer, you place under the employer's authority. In the case of a husband, a wife places herself under the husband's leadership. In the case of the husband, he has to place himself under something too. But it's not her authority. It's not her leadership. Anybody got a word to supply for that? What would husbands place themselves under for their wives? And I would suggest that you would supply the word needs there. What do I place myself under for my wife? I get to know what she legitimately needs. I live with her in a considerate way. I think about her. I think about who she is as a woman, how then she has needs just by virtue of that. I think about who she is as this particular woman, who she is. And we are naturally different. And so as a husband called to lead her by loving her, then I want to get to know her, consider who she is, what she needs, and do my level best to meet her legitimate needs. And this is such an important thing for husbands that here's what the last line in 1 Peter 3:7 says. You do this, quote, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Like God cares so much about this that our men, failure to do this impacts our relationship with the Lord. So there is this natural diversity. And it is deep natural diversity. Male and female, but then as I said earlier, wiring, diverse wiring. Women are wired differently from other women. Men are wired differently from other men. So just like I'm to study my wife in order to love her better so that I know what her needs are and how I can help to meet those, just like I'm supposed to do that, I should also learn to appreciate the natural diversity, the natural differences in wiring between the people that God brings into my life. And say they don't have to be like me, because I'm not the standard. So there's natural diversity, and then there's nurture diversity. Nurture. And this nurture diversity is how we're different because we had a different old man and a different old woman, a different home. That is, we came from different backgrounds. We were nurtured differently. And when you bring any two people together, you got both of those. You got nature diversity and you got nurture diversity. And you've got to deal with both. And if you set yourself up at the standard, you will not appreciate, which is what the middle of page 16 says, you won't appreciate that diversity. You'll chafe against that diversity. You'll try to change that. You'll try to change that person into what you want them to be. So when we talk about here, God's workshop, appreciating diversity, I'm suggesting to you that this diversity, the areas for this diversity go very deep, and they include nature and nurture. So if you're thinking about this class primarily in terms of your marriage, then think about your spouse and how God has wired them differently. And they have tendencies that are different, but can be complementary to yours. And vice versa. And that's the way you should look at other people's natural diversity. And then you've got the nurturing diversity. Kim and I are quite different. Quite different. Neither of us is better, but we're different. And she helps me to be better. And I help her to be better. As Rocky Balboa said to Adrian, he said, "Yo, Adrian." And then he told her what it is he likes about her. He goes, "You know what? I got gaps, and you got gaps. But together, we ain't got no gaps." That's what he said. But he's right. That's the way it is. We all got gaps that need to be filled, and relationships are God's workshop for doing that. The relationships are designed to make me better than I was outside of the relationship. They're designed for me to make the person with whom I'm in relationship better than they were outside of it, before they came into it. That's what God desires. Now, you think to yourself, if you're still awake, you say, well, okay, that's the design. We should make each other better. We should fill in each other's gaps. We should complement each other. All of that, that's all true. That would be great if it worked that way. I'm married to a jerk. Pastor. And I don't think I want any gap filling going on here. All right, so what am I supposed to do? And God's workshop includes that. Because what is God trying to produce in his workshop? What's God trying to produce in you, in me? He's trying to reproduce, remake his image. He is fixing us because we need to be fixed. Remember, we were made in the image of God. That means we were made to be mirrors that reflect God. Remember, sin cracks the mirrors. So your whole life and everything God brings into it is designed for God to be repairing the cracks that are your mirror. And one of the ways he fills in those cracks, repairs those cracks, is the relationships that he gives to you. Even the hard relationships. Because those relationships expose things about you that you didn't know were there. Those relationships expose cracks in your mirror that you didn't even know you had. Nothing exposes us like marriage, like deep relationships. And so you're in relationship, you're interacting with another person, and how you respond, how you act is exposing things about you, cracks in the mirror that need to be repaired. So even if you're married to the jerk, and the gap filling is not happening the way it's supposed to, the crack filling is. Yes, it's true, both parties are supposed to be helping each other fill in the gaps. But even when one party isn't participating, isn't doing that, God is still engaged in his mirror repair project in your life. So then you approach the relationship that way. Even an adverse relationship is God's means to his good end. If you look at page 17, fourth paragraph. God wants us to be mature, to be built up, and to stop acting like infants. He wants the things that ruled Christ's heart to rule ours. Relationships are God's tool for doing this construction. This is where the true value of relationships runs counter to what we normally think. That's what I was just saying. It runs counter to what we normally think. We normally think that the only kind of helpful relationship is a good relationship. We all want good relationships. I hope that all of you will put into practice the principles that we've been going through so that you will have good and harmonious relationships, for sure. But you can't dictate that, can you? You can't dictate what the other person does in a particular relationship. Paul recognized that in Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. Romans 12:18, he said, live at peace with everyone. Then he offered these disclaimers, these caveats. As much as it depends on you, if it is possible, live at peace with everyone. So you can't guarantee that that will happen. What you can guarantee is that God is in his workshop even in that difficult relationship. And he's using that relationship to expose the areas of your mirror that need to be repaired. Now, what's God's end game in all of that? Bottom of page 17. God's workshop, our struggle, and God's agenda. And you have Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 to 32, going to the next page. All of that, don't turn yet. I want to show you something on page 17. But I'm just telling you, we've got this long quote of verses 17 to 32. It spills over to the next page. But please look at verse 24. It's the second from the last paragraph. Starts with, that, however, is not the way of life you learned. When you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus, you were taught with regard to your former way of life, put off your old self. And then verse 23, to be made new in the attitude of your minds and now here's what I want you to see, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. You heard me say you were originally made in the image of God. You also heard me remind you that because of sin, that mirror you were made to be does not reflect God accurately. It's cracked. And God is repairing the mirror, and he's repairing the mirror, notice, to do this, to be created like God. To put that another way, to restore the image. To be made like God in true righteousness and holiness. So God's objective, God's agenda has always been for God's character to be reflected back to him in the image bearers that he made. Then with sin, because that image is not reflected accurately back to him, God is using relationships and everything else in your life as part of his workshop in order to restore that. And that's what this verse is saying. You put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. All right, look at page 18. Finally, Paul lays out what relationships look like when God's purpose rules. He identifies 7 tendencies of the human heart that are damaging to relationships, disruptive of God's purpose, and they require constant battling. So I'm going to bounce through these in like 2 minutes and we'll be done, because time's up. But as we go through these, contrast what the verses that are on the bottom of page 17 and the top of page 18, Ephesians 4:17 to 32, talks about putting off and putting on. Each of the things that we're to put on is to be a reflection of the character of God. I'm going to show that to you. We're going to bounce through it. So you've got these tendencies of the sinful heart that are in those verses. Those tendencies are what you have to put off. But then we're told what instead we're to put on, and what I'm telling you is that each of the things we're to put on is an aspect of the character of God. So look at these 7. The tendency toward self-indulgence. So instead of self-indulgence, we are to put on God-indulgence. Okay? Instead of indulging myself, we are to be people who are indulgent in our Creator, live a God-centered life. But then there are specific actions. That's general. Here are some specific actions. Verse 25, number 2 there, the tendency toward deceit. So if I'm to put off deceit, what am I supposed to put on? Truthfulness, right? And that's an aspect of the character of God. Why am I supposed to be truthful? Because God is truthful. Why am I supposed to be honest? Because God is. The tendency toward anger. So what am I supposed to put on instead of sinful anger? I'm supposed to put on righteous anger. There is such a thing as righteous anger. God is angry, but his anger is always righteous. It's good and right for us to be angry when someone has harmed another and they are unrepentant. So there is such a thing as righteous anger, so we put that on. Selfishness, we have a tendency toward that. We put that off. The opposite is selfless. So what is love according to the Bible? I give you this working definition over the years. Love is doing what's in the best interest of another. So in selflessness, we love others. We do what's in their best interest. That's what God does with us, selfless. Number 5, the tendency toward unhelpful communication. Instead of unhelpful communication, we engage in, for lack of a better term, edifying communication. Communication that builds up. That's what God does. The tendency toward division. Instead of that, toward unity. Again, it's what God does. And then toward an unforgiving spirit. Instead of an unforgiving spirit, it's forgiveness. All right? Next week, you don't need to bring these sheets back then. Next week, we will give you the 13-point plan for how to move toward reconciliation. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for the blessings of the Lord's Day. Thank you for these brothers and sisters and friends who you've allowed to be here for us to consider what you taught to your people through the work of Ezra and what we can learn in a derivative way from there and apply to our lives. And now, Lord, about this important area of relationships, we want to pursue them in a way that honors you and accomplishes your purposes. So, Lord, thank you for retraining our thinking with your word. We have a natural way of looking at all things, and very often it's wrong. And that's because our natural perspective is tainted by a sin nature. And so that what is natural is often sinful. It's often wrong. So thank you for correcting our thinking so that we can then correct our speaking and our acting. Help us to do that this week. Help us to think differently. Help us to think in line with what we've discussed from your word today. May we put it in practice. We ask you to grant us safety and bring us back together next Lord's Day. In the name of Jesus, amen.